upstate New York. I have, I'm not sure if we met in passing once, but we certainly haven't had, did we met in passing, or is this the first time we're actually meeting?
I think this is the first time.
I've heard about you and your teaching for a really long time, and I've always wanted to connect and take a class from you. And when you offered this opportunity to learn from you here, it seemed like what a perfect connection. How neat for us to meet professionally in the context of sharing permaculture. Not only are you sharing with a small group here made up of a lot of staff on site here at COSM, but we will pulse the word and learnings of this along with your website info through our million-person social network after this, and kind of allow the ripple of this encounter with this initial small group to reach out and inspire and connect people all over the world. So without further ado, I'll let you maybe give a little more of an introduction to yourself since we're just meeting now, but thank you so much. Let's give Javin a nice warm welcome. Thank you so much, buddy.
Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks for being part of the course. It's a huge piece, and I have been a part of over 50 different types of permaculture design certificates over the last 9 years, and I keep saying that the reason I go back is I meet such incredible people. It's an interesting slice of life, and you meet some really fantastic folks. So thanks so much for jumping into this course and allowing me to be part of your class today. We've got a few folks on a webinar as well, so welcome to those folks as well, and welcome to anybody who decides to watch this on YouTube. So just thank you so much. My name is Javin Kirby-Bernakovich, and I've been involved with permaculture and regenerative land design for the last 9 years. I jumped in and sort of head, hands, and feet 9 years ago when I realized that the job that I was actively involved in, which was working with environmental education and taking kids down the North Saskatchewan River watershed, wasn't really getting the itch scratched of wanting to make a difference and wanting folks to see the world in perhaps a light that allows for that interconnectivity between ecology and people, because we created such an incredible divide over the last 150, 250 years. And so I was going down I was going down the North Saskatchewan River with my kids one day, junior high kids, and they were barely looking up from their phones to listen to a bit of the interpretation we had on this beautiful, incredible river that flows through the city of Edmonton that was originally in the Arctic Circle in the province of Alberta. And I said to them, just kind of off the cuff, you know what it's like if you've ever worked with kids, you're trying to engage them and speak to them. And I said off the cuff, you know, what if we had 10 units of natural resources? And what if we used or needed 1 unit of those natural resources to live per year? How long could we live? And there was this sort of quintessential hockey player as is such in places like Edmonton was like, oh, it's easy. You could live for 10 years. And, everyone kind of looked up from the cell phones and then went right back down. And I said, okay, well, what if you took that unit of natural resources and used it, but also was able to take and give back most of that back into the ecology that you took it from in the first place? And there was this sort of quintessential fashionista who wore high heels onto the boat as we went down the river and said, well, I guess you could live forever. And just her slight mental shift, pulling the big toe of somebody to help kind of pull them into a different perspective, made her go, well, wait a second, what are you talking about? So we had this really incredible conversation that lasted for the last 25 minutes of the boat ride. And the hockey player talked about how recycled hockey sticks should be the mandatory piece within the NHL. And the fashionista was talking about how trash and shows should be commonplace, and they weren't at the time, about taking different types of clothes and still working with fashion and how we want to express ourselves. But it made me realize that there was potentially more I could be doing to change mindsets and to have the effect I wanted. So I worked in construction for a number of years. I was working with my father in construction, slave labor, still working for your family. And I thought, well, maybe it's building. Maybe that's where I've got to apply myself. And so I looked around and tried to find an alternative building program. And I found the natural building program at One United Resource Eco Village over on Vancouver Island. And so I jumped in and I learned all about building with clay and sand and stone and straw. And towards the end of the course, somebody says, hey, there's this thing called a permaculture design certificate. Maybe you want to take it. Now, I'm from Alberta, and if you don't know some of the stereotypes of Alberta, you can kind of think of folks who are from Alberta, or Alberta itself, as kind of the product of a one-night stand between Texas and Montana. It's kind of the bigger, better buck with go, go, go. And I was sitting there and I'd already experienced permaculture because we had a friend who came to visit in Edmonton, and they said they were going to stay for the weekend, but they ended up staying for 3 months. So when I heard permaculture, I heard mooching. And permaculture was just an extended form of learning how to take without reciprocation. So I said, you know what, I'm okay. I don't need to take the course. And he said, well, it's half off the price. And being Albertan, I tend to look for a good deal. So I said, okay, well, let's take it. And I was sitting there, and the very first day we talked about the prime directive of permaculture, to take responsibility for ourselves and for that of our children, to take care of the earth, because that's where all assets, that's where all capital, that's where all life comes from. To take care of each other, because that's how we distribute and increase that amount of wealth we have. And then finally, to set limits to consumption and redistribute that surplus. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. You know, I'd looked through a number of different types of religious teachings and spiritual teachings. And I thought, this is on point. This is exactly what I've been looking for. This is guidelines that help to align life. And then I was given the 12 David Holmgren principles of permaculture. And as the namesake of the Quakers implies, they only speak when they quake. And I raised my hand trembling. And the instructor, Jan Steinman, said, what is it? I said, this is incredible. Like, this seems like a place that you could dive for the rest of your life and you could never come up for air. And I did. I dove in with hands, heart, and feet, as my Cuba permaculturalist friends would say. And I didn't look up for, and still haven't looked up for, the last 9 years. I've worked internationally in Cuba, in Kenya, and Uganda, putting in projects that are still producing food and inspiration for the folks around them. I was just speaking with the project I worked on in Kenya in 2013, and it's still producing over 1,000 kilos of tilapia a year for the farmers in that area. My good friends are down in Cuba right now. I've had the ability to consult internationally and work locally. But something that I've really enjoyed is being involved with teaching so much. I found that the end of a permaculture design course, that last sort of hour that was classically given to me of where to from here, was really underserved. We didn't really get a good sense about what to do with permaculture afterwards. So having a background in personal development and leadership, I started to take apart a lot of the pieces of what we could use within permaculture design to start to design our lives. And one of the major pieces I understood about this is that if you don't design your life, somebody else has already designed it for you. Some aspect, some piece, some understanding. If I haven't designed the way that I look at finances, for example, or how I feel about money, I've adopted or inherited a belief system around money from somebody else. And chances are, like hand-me-down clothes, they don't quite fit. They don't quite fit a style or the actual dimensions of who you are. And that's true about every single aspect of life. If we don't live by design, we're living by default. And that default is by somebody else. And that default that's given to us is for their benefit, not for ours. I narrowly escaped a trajectory of being a financial advisor. Years ago, I was becoming educated and trained and getting my ticket. But there was a lasting lesson that came from one of my instructors. And she said, you know, if somebody's advertising something to you, chances are it's for their benefit, not for yours. And that's really a great underpinning when we start to take a look at all the different facets of life, be it, you know, what is permaculture? How do we play with it? Because chances are the way that what you've been exposed to, the ways to potentially put it into a right livelihood, is the way that worked for one person, which is a recipe, but maybe not the way for you. And your recipe is going to be a little bit different. And so what I pulled out and what I now delivered to over, I was calculating it the other day, 500 folks over the last couple of years, is a principles-based approach with design elements out of permaculture to help live in right livelihood quicker, with less frustration and just more joy, because we only have so much time on this planet, and none of us get out of this alive. So we may as well enjoy the time we have here. I've taken a lot out of being chronically suicidally depressed for 20 years of my life. And with that, I took a lot of lessons, and I've applied a lot of those lessons to a lot of this work. So thank you again for having me. And with the introduction done, I think what we'll do is we'll jump into the information. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions. So any question you have about any of the different sections or techniques or conversations, if you're in the class or if you're on the webinar, feel free to put them in the Q&A. If you're in class, feel free to write them down, and we'll get a chance to talk about that as we go forward. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll jump right in, and we'll go a little bit into my perspective on life design for permaculture and how it applies. So Thanks again. So P.A. Yeomans is one of those figures in permaculture that is usually pretty underserved. He created the concept of keyline design, not just the keyline pattern or the keyline plow, but the entire process of how to design a farm. And he did it out of a lot of trauma and frustration. He lost family members and he lost an entire farm to a brush fire. And he said, I'm never going to let that happen again. And that drove his innovation. So the blister on his hand, the problem he really liked to solve or needed to solve in that situation, really forwarded the momentum of how he looked at it. And he has this great saying about, plan the work, then work the plan. And it's iterative because the plan is never finished. And so when I do large scale or small scale land design, as I'm doing right now for a 300-acre farm, it's called a working design. It's never finished. Just like our lives, they're always drafts, and we're just revising those drafts on and on and on and on. Now, specifically with permaculture and permaculture practitioners and promoters, there's a problem. And the problem is everyone feels like we have to save the world and we have to do it by Friday. And there's a big sort of savior complex that comes with permaculturalists that tends to trip people up pretty quickly. I was working with a gentleman down in Texas, and he had this big complex that he had to save and he had to do as much as he could. But the problem is you can't pour from an empty cup. And he was just about empty. And he hadn't taken care of that piece of take care of the earth and take care of yourself and take responsibility for yourself before he started taking a look at redistributing surplus. And Mollison and Holmgren were really intelligent. They put them in an order of sequencing. And sequencing is really important when you look at design from a land design perspective or a life design perspective. And so first and foremost, we really need to take a look at that problem of, well, how do we have the right livelihood aspect, the moral aspect, the ethical aspect of our work, but at the same time start to see progress? How do we do this? Now, I have to lean on a recently departed friend, Toby Hemingway, in his conversation about permaculture. He had this great story about the big yellow dog of permaculture. And after folks come out of a permaculture design course, it's kind of like coming out of the waters of permaculture. And anybody who's too close to this big yellow dog, as the big yellow dog starts to shake all of the water off, they kind of get hit with swale saliva and design this and herb spiral that, and they get all of this jargon. And the dog itself is kind of like, I don't really know what to do. And so they start going on this wander, this permaculture pilgrimage, trying to find, okay, well, where do I apply myself and what do I do well? And there's four major questions that people really think about. They think about, well, where should I start or where am I headed? What's best for me? What's the path that's actually going to lead best to where I want to end up? What kind of business, or is business actually for me? Should I find somebody to hire me? Should I work for a non-for-profit? Should I build my own business? Should I be an entrepreneur? And last but not least, not always people ask this question at the beginning, but they definitely ask it when it comes up. What do I do when, not if I fall? Because it's not a matter of if you're going to have personal resistance come up, if you're going to have a brittle mental landscape that's going to not potentially take care of all of the ambitions you place upon it, or you're not going to have limiting beliefs that come up and kind of start to frustrate and retard some of that forward momentum. And so those questions really come up. And so the question then becomes, what are the tools we can use to build the skills? Because we have to remember that tools are just used to build skills. They are not the end point. The permaculture design, the design process, the scale of permanence from P.A. Yeomans, it's a great tool, but we're really about trying to get to an endpoint, the destination conversation. And so the concept really is creating a map, a destination, and a compass. You've probably heard it before in permaculture. The map is not the territory. And so we have to build our own map. We have to build our own understanding of what the territory looks like. We have to understand where we're headed, or at least where we're headed next, and then where we might be headed after that. And finally, we need a place to orient. We need some kind of tool to say, okay, well, maybe this, but not this. And for most of us, making good decisions was never taught to us in elementary school or high school or post-secondary or in the job place or in our families. I know I was never taught how to make good decisions. It's something that was readily something I wanted to learn more about. So I came to this work ready to find something that really made sense. Next, we need to understand what kind of person we are, what kind of hiker, if you will. Some of us will take the long route. Some of us will take the short route. Some of us will take a look at the water and be like, let's just build a boat. Let's get in it and start paddling. But some paths are more associated with others than some of the other maybe harder or some of the easier routes. And When we take a look out in the landscape and we see Pandora Thomas, or we see Penny Livingston, or we see Jeff Lawton, or we see Sepp Holzer, it's very easy to emulate these people, thinking that that's the best way to give our gifts to this right livelihood of this world we want to see. When in fact, it's one of the most unserving processes we can create for ourselves and for the greater world, because each one of us has a unique DNA we can bring to this work. As Larry Santoyo has said brilliantly, we don't do permaculture, we use permaculture in what we do. So who are you as a person when you come to this, and what roots are inherently open to you than others? The boots conversation is really about how do we transact progress for the materials or the equipment we have? And then finally, how much training have we put into this journey? Are we prepared for it? And when we fall down, not if, do we have the first aid ready to help with that? So the tools I've come across are holistic life context, zones of brilliance, regenerative business design, and mindset strengthening. I'm going to go through them one by one to give you a sense about what these tools are and how you can access them yourself to do what it is you want to do with permaculture. So I'm a long-time hiker, backcountry camper and woodsman, something that really brings a lot of joy to me. So I've created this conversation around this metaphor of taking this yellow dog pilgrimage and going for this hike. So here we are at the beginning of the journey, and what potentially might be useful to us is understanding a map, a destination, and a compass. And I'll tell you this much: holistic life context is based upon the great work of Alan Savory and holistic management. And his big conversation came from erroneously thinking that it was the elephants that were denuding the landscape that he was charged with trying to figure out why it was eroding. And instead of taking a look at the biggest conversation possible as holistically as possible, he just took a look at the little symptom. And the symptom was elephants are eating foliage. We should be killing elephants. And he called for the call of almost 40,000 elephants, which he calls the greatest blunder of his life. And what he pulled out of that was that humans have classically made really bad decisions about management. And we are really poor managers. And that comes down to making decisions based upon the most largest context possible. So if I am building a context for myself, it'd be around my life. If I'm building it around this course, it would be around the course. If it'd be about a relationship, the business, the business. But it means I'm going to start to get a sense of what are all the pieces in play. And that helps us to start to build a map, an understanding of all the different pieces that we need to understand how to make really good decisions. And in that, understand what our destination point will be, because the destination will change if we're working on a life level, if we're working on a business level. I was working with a couple of clients, farmers in Prince Edward Island, which is a province in British Columbia, which is an island in Canada, not British Columbia. And one of the main things that they've been working on is what's our destination? Where do we want to get as a relationship, as a farm couple? Is it getting to an end point in terms of dollars? Is it a state of being? But understanding that destination is important, because as we go through life, there's going to be other designs that are going to be wanted to be placed upon us to take us off of that. Again, if we don't design our lives, others will design it for us, because we all have horsepower we can put behind other people and they'll readily take it from us. And then finally, how do we orient ourselves? How do we understand? And this is where the decision-making process of a holistic context, and adapted as I have with holistic life context, comes into play. And we literally take decisions and we pair them up against what we want to be true, and it becomes a filter. Does this decision allow us to have the life we want to have and build the life that we want to create? So that starts the conversation off. Already we've got 3 brilliant tools that we can use to create a life that works for us. Next, we have zones of brilliance. So this was really based upon the idea of zones within permaculture. Zones in permaculture is really about frequency of use and centers of initiative. So things that we need to access more frequently or closer to the home or the center of human initiative, and things that we don't need to use are actually moved out a little bit further. And in that, for you as individuals, you have gifts and passions and problems that you like to work on more than anybody else. And those really are the roots. Those are the different ways to bring ourselves to a place. Those are the passions we have, the browser tabs that stay open even late in the night, the things we'll talk about with people for days or hours on end. In permaculture, there tends to be a small sector of us that love talking about composting human waste, and we're definitely the weirdos. We find nerdvana in talking about the rate of decomposition of human manure, but that's really where you're kind of in that stream of that DNA of passion. Next, there's some skills that we bring to our work in permaculture, and we come with those skills, we come with those gifts. And finally, there's problems. Now, think of it this way. When I say that water is a big aspect of permaculture, all of you would probably nod and say, yeah, that's true. And now if I said, what's the biggest problem you see with water? Well, the problem you see with water is not the same problem I see with water. So even in the broad concept of water, each of us has a specific aspect in that we think is more important. So we literally have all these different types of roots that come into the same place. But the chances are there's going to be one that's really important for you, one that actually fits you better than anything else. And that's where Zones of Brilliance tries to aim. It tries to get a really good sense about who you are as an individual and where are those sweet spots, those native niches for business or for work or otherwise, where you actually excel better than anybody else. I was working with this young man who was a skateboarder, and we took a look at his passion, skateboarding, his skills. He had this incredible wild style graffiti. And the problem was he didn't see that his local skateboarding community really understood that there were medicinal plants, not the medicinal plants you're thinking about, but the medicinal plants that could help them when they were skateboarding and hurting themselves in the skate park. And so he started to develop this beautiful little sweet spot that we worked on. He was creating these amazing cards all about specific types of plants that would help skateboarders and building them into artwork for decks and these beautiful artwork books. It was a real specific niche that nobody else was actually eligible for. I'm definitely not eligible for that, but he was. And that's the specific thing about Zones of Brilliance. Finally, this idea of regenerative business design is an important one. There's lots of folks that have good intent, and I'd rather work with people who have good intent and help them with a little bit of business conversation to help them realize that they can apply themselves really well than take somebody that's completely profit driven and try and instill some kind of ethics into them. So regenerative business design is really about the boots, the different type of equipment, and some equipment works well and some equipment doesn't. You're not necessarily going to be walking in a loafer, going on a long hike. You may do it for the approach, but definitely not in the long conversation. And when we talk about business, it's really about the shape of the vessel as opposed to the horsepower that's more important. Think about that for a second. Not all businesses are built the same. Some businesses are built lean, some businesses are built quite large and bloated. And even businesses that have a good ethical aim usually don't have a good sense about what their streamlined ability is to cut through whatever the fluid dynamic, be it is working with communities or working with individuals. When I think about a good friend of mine who just went down to Haiti and did this incredible project that took care of 40% of the caloric needs of this village. His business is so lean that he can come into a place, stay there for 9 days, work with the populace, build an incredible installation that'll feed them if they decide to work with it, to the point to where the pastor says, we've had NGOs come down here for the last 6 years. They stay in the big hotels. They eat all this fancy food. They come and they talk at us, and then they walk away. Whereas you've come, slept on the floor with us, worked with us, sung our songs, and been part of us. And that's two completely different types of business models. One is very lean, and one is potentially a little bit bigger, and it doesn't quite deflect or move as agilely as one might want. And then finally, we have this idea of first aid and training or mindset strengthening, because in some way, shape, or form, we all have some kind of brittle landscape. And Mollison and Holmgren really honed in on this by saying the first prime directive of permaculture is to take responsibility for yourself. Consider that for a second. They said that was the first piece. Take responsibility for yourself. Make sure that your garden is well in order. And it was metaphorical, it was literal, but make sure that your mindset, your conversation, that you can be of value to other individuals. And then on the other side, make sure that you're able to transact when those frustrations or those limiting beliefs come up. And how many times do we have to use it along the road? So many times. There's so many moments when we lose that fragile mental scape. That's so important to be able to cut through. So with all of these four aspects, we take a look at holistic life context, the map, the compass, the destination, zones of brilliance, taking a look at roots, regenerative business design, the boots, and taking a look at that first aid and training, the mindset strengthening and limiting belief. All of this is to get us to a place of having a ruthless clarity of vision. Now, you can't be kind of in your ruthless clarity of vision. You can't be kind of pregnant. You are or you are not. You are in that ruthless clarity of vision or you are not. And that's where we start. We start with holistic life context. And this is the map, the destination, and the compass. And to give you an example, I'm sure Delvin gets this as well, and other designers. You always get the call, and I got one last week in email format saying, hey, I've watched a bunch of Jeff Lawton videos, and I want a permaculture farm, as if I'm some kind of permaculture vending machine, and you press the button, and out comes the permaculture farm. And every single time we go through and we start to talk about, well, what's the quality of life you want out of this farm? Well, I want to be close to nature. I want to raise my family in a safe place. I want to have access to high quality food. I want to generally be in a healthy, clean environment. I want to feel like I'm doing some good in the world. Well, all of those are quality of lives that don't necessarily need the farm to happen. Like if you think about where can you access high quality of food, even in an urban setting, we can go all the way from dumpster diving to growing it ourselves to community group buying, bulk buying, all the way to, working with farmers. Like there's so many different ways. And that's where modern society has really trained us to have the goals over quality of life. The thing is more important than the quality of life, and we'll sacrifice all of the quality of life for it. So these farmers want clean living, potential farmers close to nature. They want to be working with their hands. They want to raise their families safely. They want to know their food. They want to be of service and value. But what happens if you've ever built a farm? The weight and the pressure of that starts to erode some of that quality of life, and then erodes a bit more. And then all of a sudden we've lost all of the actual pieces we wanted with the farm because we've let the goal completely supplant it. Now, this is one of the great revolutionary moments of holistic life context, is that it flips the conversation. Quality of life goes first and goals go underneath. And that means that we can test if the barn's a good idea, if working with different types of forestry is a good idea for this farm, if working with different types of animals are a good idea. It doesn't matter what it is. We can test to see if any one of these pieces is actually a good fit for this quality of life, for this one specific thing that we're looking at. It means that we can test any conversation and make sure that, yeah, okay, the barn seems like a good idea and animals do, but you know what, forestry in this situation doesn't make sense. And we know that this is all the pieces we're working with. So holistic life context is a tool to help you build the skill of thinking holistically and acting holistically. It's not the end goal. And in that, there's three important pieces. We can break it right down. We want to know what you want. And once we know what you want, we have to figure out what you have to do to get what you want. And then we have to create a monitoring process to know if it's true. I'm sure you guys talked about it in your permaculture design course. Monitoring is really important. What are the metrics to make sure that we're getting there? I use a really simple way of monitoring the soil and taking soil tests to know that my efforts are improving. When I grow a garden or I work with clients, especially when I work with restaurant clients, we use a Brix meter, a refractometer, to measure the suspended sugars to see if actually the nutrition of the plant is higher with our efforts of compost extract and cover cropping and all the number of things we do. We have to have good metrics. So if I or the project, the whole we're managing, want X, we need to do Y. And I'll know X and Y are happening or true if I observe Z. So this idea of a whole, or the project you're working on, yourself, your life, this incredible center you folks are in, all of these different types of wholes can have a want, they can have the doing aspect and the monitoring aspect. And in that, there's a present, so an inventory, and then there's a future piece. And along comes this decision, as it always does in life. And we need to test it to see, is this a good idea? Does this make good sense? Now, normally, what do we do when we make decisions? We take a look at it, we say, well, what does my gut think? And we walk along. Or maybe we do a pro and cons list. But really, if you're making a pro and cons list, you already know that there's something about this that doesn't make sense. But this is the great innovation that Alan Savory gave us, is that we've got a system of taking a look at any whole, any project, and saying, okay, what's true today? What's the inventory? And what's the future look like? Now, if you're looking for more information on this, I highly recommend Dan Palmer's incredible work from Very Edible Gardens and his holistic management article set. He did a series of 3 articles, exceptionally well done, really well iterated. And I just want to say great thanks to Dan for doing that work, because he really started to simplify it. But it really did start with holistic management. The Savory Institute and Holistic Management International really added to that. Veg did, I did some contribution, and so did a great friend of mine, Dakota Cohen. And all of this is to create a context that's a specific approach for making environmentally, socially, and economically sound decisions towards a holistic context, to a greater conversation. And in that, we get a sense of what the inventory is, what the context is, what the future looks like, and testing questions. And this was really confusing to me for a long time, until I realized that it just needed more stick people. So here we are in a hole. Here comes this decision. We know that this is a permaculturalist because they have a pitchfork and they've got boots. And here comes this decision, and we have to make a decision. And some decisions, we pass and it makes sense, or it doesn't make sense. And we get a good sense if it works for our context. And once we have that idea or that decision, we run it through a process of assuming that the decision is wrong. We decide to do it. We monitor and establish these indicators. We design, plan, and implement. We observe and monitor. And around and around and around it goes. So it creates a really good way of starting to decide and build and create that decision, that destination, that map, and that compass. And that's a great first step. If I could do it again, if I could go all the way back 9 years ago, I would have learned about holistic context and now holistic life context first. It's such an incredible tool. I would say it's the most important tool. And pretty commonly, it saves folks anywhere between $4,000 and $10,000 within the first 3 months of using it, just because we start looking at things holistically. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about zones of brilliance. And so any questions, so just make sure to write them down or put them in the Q&A, and I'll address them at the end. So zones of brilliance are really about roots, are really about finding the pathway for you. And in that, we use a bit of a bullseye conversation. So we take a look at the perennial passions, the things that come up time and time and time again. I'm just gaga about big, broad scale water conversations, about understanding watersheds on the 25, on the 3,000 square kilometer range, because that just excites me. That's something that's really specific. I can work on the roof level, I can work on the urban level, but it's the broad landscape that really gets me excited. Inherent gifts, what are the gifts we have? Obviously, as my mom found out when I was younger, I have the gift of gab, I can talk. That's a gift that I was given. I also have a gift of entrepreneurial insights and counsel. Those are gifts that we have specifically. That's part of our DNA, our soul DNA. If you've ever looked into Plotkin's work or Helmsworth work, all of that comes with us when we come in. And then finally, what are the perceived problems that you specifically see? I think Joseph Campbell got it wrong. It's not follow your bliss. I think it should be more follow your blisters. Follow the things that you're willing to really go through the dirt and go through the muck and go through the frustration of. And in that, you get to that center spot, and that's the sweet spot. And that sweet spot changes. Life is this wonderful river of time, and we can't step in the same spot at any one time twice, which means that that sweet spot today is going to be different than it is in 10 years. When I started, the sweet spot for me was creating my bachelor's in permaculture, which was creating a company, an education company called Permaculture BC. And what I did is I brought in these incredible educators. And with that, I got a chance to speak with them and learn from them and offer courses and create a little bit of income. But that was the sweet spot for me 10 years ago. It's not the sweet spot for me now. And my sweet spot now won't be my sweet spot in another 10 years. So this is a monitoring piece as well. So what do we do? How do we work with this? Well, once we start to populate these three areas, the passions, the gifts, and the problems, we ask three specific questions of anything we populate. So maybe you have a gift of wise counsel. Maybe you have a gift of hospitality, as a recent client of mine had. Well, we ask three questions of anything we populate those three areas with. We say, do I enjoy this? Do you enjoy hospitality? And this client I'm thinking of said, yeah, of course, I do love it. I said, do you have skill of hospitality? She said, yeah, I've been doing it for a long time. And the last question, which a lot of people don't understand because they don't understand what regenerative means, is, am I more for this? Is there more of me after this conversation? And sure enough, that was the case for her. So we ask these three questions, we literally grade just like we would grade material or soil or diamonds, and we high grade that material. And those high graded pieces of passions and gifts and problems come to the center. And in that, we get these incredible zones of brilliance, the places where you and you alone, as of today, are incredibly brilliant and you have an incredible niche. So I'm going to give you a couple of case studies and we'll see if you can figure out potentially what these folks did. So these folks were in a PDC that I guest taught at the end of 4, 5, 6 years ago now. They had a great passion for permaculture and food, that a gift for organization and motivation, and that a problem locally of no good local food access. So just think for a second, what do you think these folks did? Did they make a farm? Did they make a food truck? What did they do? Well, these folks were in a business design and life design workshop I gave at the end of this PDC. It was a full day. And I said, if I was in your scenario, if I was in your area, I would either do a food aggregator and create an amazing circle of trust, or I would start to grow mushrooms. Well, what they did was nothing short of amazing. They created FarmBound, which was accessing and connecting with local farmers and bringing the highest quality food to their local populace and region. Did incredible work, have an incredible amount of income that comes in. There's Jay, and just did exceptional work with such a small idea. The end of all permaculture design courses, I give what's called the 10-10-100 challenge, which is after your PDC, you have 10 days, you have 10 hours, and you can spend no more than $100 of your local currency to apply what you've done immediately. You don't get to wait. And the reason I say that is that the world is in the state it's in. We don't have time for waiting. We don't have time for any more analysis or paralysis by analysis or analysis by paralysis. We need to start to put efforts into the ground and see what's working out. And they did. They built this within 2 months after the PDC. I couldn't have been more blown away by them. They did an incredible job. Next case study, there was a good friend of mine who had this passion for remediating soil. She was a writer, an interviewer, a storyteller, and she found that there was no remediation resource out there. There was nothing. There was no book she could turn to. So what did she do? Think about it for a second. Well, this is another brilliant business process or establishing reputation. She went out and she interviewed all of these incredible remediators, and she wrote this incredible book, Lila Darwish, Earth Repair, how to repair with phyto, with myco, with all these different types of remediation. She built the asset. And then afterwards, she was asked to come and build her competency from all these people she interviewed. And now she's down in New Orleans working at a master's for disaster management. You can see the arc of these people as they start to get into the stream of what they're curious about. Another great case study, this brilliant city planner had a passion for city spaces and permaculture, was an urban planner, and found that there was no permaculturist working on a city level. She came down with me to Cuba for a 21-day PDC where we design and install a brilliant installation for a local Cuban farmer, thereby transferring a bunch of the wealth of the students and putting it into the folks there. And Lindsay Meads then connected with another brilliant designer in Calgary, Adrian Buckley, and they created Regenerate Design. And now they work really closely with urban and city affiliated, municipal affiliated organizations, specifically schools, private and public, and working with park revitalization, because she already spoke city-anese. She spoke city planner. So she was able to find herself in there really quickly. Another great case study. This woman had a great passion for women in agriculture. She writer, an interviewer, storyteller. There was no source for women in permaculture stories. So she wrote this brilliant book that's just coming out called Women Who Dig, Trina Moyles. What a great book. What a brilliant idea. And each chapter is a different country that she lived in and worked and spoke with the women and told their stories. All of these case studies are really about just finding the passions, the gifts, and the problems, and then finding a place to play. This gentleman, great passion for expressing design, was an illustrator. And the problem is, as most designers realize, is that they're not artists. I definitely am not. And this was a student in my class. And so they started to illustrate a number of my designs because they were brilliant at what they did. They were able to translate that really easily. A friend of mine had a passion for epic shit, was an interviewer, had curiosity in exploring, and found that there was a lack of permaculture business examples. So Diego Footer built this process and this conversation of podcasts called Permaculture Voices, and really started to show what business was like. It's not for everybody. It's not everybody's podcast, but it really did show a different side of permaculture that really wasn't out there. And lastly, great student and colleague, passion for hand tools, gifts for forging, and really saw a lack of homemade tools. So Reforged Ironworks was born, Tim Wickstrom. And so he started to take old leaf springs and lots of different reclaimed metal, started working on the forge and building these simple tools that would be legacy pieces. You could hand down these tools to your children, to your great-grandchildren, because they would always be there. So zones of brilliance are really these pathways. And all of these individuals I'm showing you now have already recreated new pathways for themselves. that's the great thing about mimicking nature and mimicking design, is that the shrew or the jaguar or the little tiny aphid all have to create their own niche for themselves. They have to find and interact. Nobody's saying, here's your niche, here's your food. There's none of that actually in ecology. You have to mimic nature within this. And mimicking is finding your path, finding your way, and finding how you're going to transact with the greater ecology. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit, or second to last, we're going to talk about regenerative business design, the boots. Now think about this. If you're ever learned about total immersion swimming, Terry McLaughlin, Terry was in swimming for a long time, and he realized that the way we swim was actually really backwards, that all of the studies of swimmers was that we would use maybe 10% of all the effort we put into the water for forward motion. And he really looked at it, and he leveraged this wonderful saying by Bill Boomer, who was a swim coach at the University of Rochester: the shape of the vessel matters more than the size of the engine. Think about it. If you're the cuboid boat, if you're the big square boat, and you have the same power engine on the cuboid boat versus the V-shaped boat, which one's going to go further with the less amount of energy, with the less amount of fuel put in? Shape, or the shape of the vessel, does matter. And all of these pieces stack on each other. So once you have that whole under management, that holistic context, that zones of brilliance, that becomes the core honeycomb. And in that, you can, of course, add more tessellation. You can add more pieces. This pattern repeats, right? It rhymes with itself. And you have those testing questions to say, which of these enterprises that I'm going to play with actually makes sense? So this was my income watershed years ago, about 2 years ago, where I taught PDCs, I did short courses, I did life design, I did actual design, I did installations, consultations, speaking, coach, teaching international, teaching Skype, webinars like this, mentoring. And those were the cores. Those were the ones that routinely flooded in the income watershed. Then there were other trickles that I wanted to play with. I was in natural building for a long time. I did nursery and tree crops and plant sales. Currently, I do a little bit of affiliate sales and some YouTube and graphic renders. I did a microgreen company for about a year. I don't do it anymore, but I'm always testing. I'm always seeing which one of these actually makes sense for me. And I think what you folks have realized, and probably to a certain extent about why you ended up in this permaculture design course, is that the market for something to believe in is infinite. We need positive stories. We need solution-oriented future conversations that bring people to the forefront, that don't push them away. And that's where regenerative business design, and specifically regenerative business mentorship, came from. It was my friend in that beautiful sweater in top left, Rob Avis, and I really wanted to pass on the principles to our friends, our colleagues in design and farming. And this was a Christmas party we had with the students from the last year. And we got together and we saw what the value was of having honest and frank conversations with a group of entrepreneurs. And the major thing that these folks said was, it was so great to have a group of collective folks who really wanted to improve their conversation. There's a number of podcasts you can read, you can listen about this, that we've given away the principles. You can listen to them on your own, but some of them just think about for a second, and really take notice if you have friction towards this principle, because that's part of those limiting beliefs conversations. So the first one, we are profitable, we do not subsidize. That doesn't mean that we don't give some of our work away. It means that the core of our work can sustain us and our family. So one of the individuals in this course realized early on that the way that they were taking a look at the potential crops that they were providing, they weren't focusing on the high value crops. They were focusing on what was coming in from China that they could never compete with ever. Eventually, we'll probably get to a place where a heritage potato exists, but chances are it's not going to be anytime soon. And so that was a really important piece for individuals to understand, is that we need to build these businesses that are profitable first and foremost, because we still run in a world based upon some level of finances, of money. I lived on $7,500 a year for a couple of years to see if I could do it, and less. I've also lived on much more. And those experiments really show the conversation that money helps to solve money problems. Money doesn't solve non-money problems. It doesn't help necessarily build community or transact emotions too well, but it does have that one specific conversation. Knowing and communicating our value, knowing what we bring to the field, being different, just being able to say what I do is different. Each of us have a different way of expressing ourselves. And if you have two different design consultation companies or installation companies, knowing how you're different, knowing why you work differently for a company or for a client is really important. Maybe you have a great love of making sure that the indoors and the outdoors coalesce. So folks I'm going to show you up next, they worked with restaurants and grocery stores to have in grocery store food forest, potted food forest that showed the perennial food conversation. That's a part of their point of view. And it's an incredible conversation to show. If marketing frustrates you, I highly recommend you over to my friend Tad Hargrave's marketingforhippies.com. He does a great conversation about how to make marketing just about storytelling. So with that, let's talk about what's in a name, just to give you a bit of an example. So friends of mine that I was working with for a couple of years, they started to create this business and see if you can understand what their business is about. Originally, their business in 2013 was called Food Forest Worldwide. So logically, you would think that they create food forest and they do this internationally, and you would be wrong. In 2014, they changed it to Integrated Living Landscapes. Well, what is that? Well, like, there's so much jargon in this, right? This is going back to knowing and communicating your value and being able to differentiate. We're still in a bunch of jargon that people don't understand. Then they moved to just living landscapes. And finally, one of the suggestions they were given years ago, they decided to go with edible living landscapes. Eat the world, like have food everywhere. And by the visual language of their branding, by their conversation, by what you see their work looks like, you know exactly what they do. So one of those really important pieces of business is make sure that the name of your business, the name of your enterprise, directly applies to the solution you're giving people, that it goes towards where you're going to help them end up at. You're taking from this Isle of woe, this island they live on with problems, and you're going to bring them to a place of solution and speak about the solutions. I wanted to give you a $10,000 tool before I completed this conversation. And out of all the business design tools I found, nothing has been more valuable than the business model canvas. This is a one sheet. It's a book with a sheet. You can find the sheet online. It's easy to download. And in it are all the individual pieces you need to really understand the model of the business you want to play with and how to streamline it. So I think that is a great place to leave you guys with that conversation. And finally, when we talk about these pieces of permaculture, when we talk about these pieces of limiting beliefs, of mindset strengthening, if you've talked about it yet, landscapes can be brittle, which means that instead of decomposing organically, they decompose through oxidization, which is a problem. And similarly, our mindsets can be incredibly brittle. We get to a place where we actually can't understand our conversation or how we work within our lives. And strengthening that, making sure that we respond versus react, making sure that we are understanding that we only argue with reality, but we only suffer when we argue with reality, but only 100% of the time. You know, these are simple tools that we can use to really understand our own situations and build a lot of resiliency. And I think that's an important piece, because most of the farmers I work with on life design, they come with a lot of limiting beliefs. They come with frustrations and resistance and a number of pieces that if they would think about and work on, they would be much further along. I'll give you an example. I was working with these farmers who literally made the best poultry I'd ever seen. It had the best amount of free range nature. It had the best access to insects because chickens are omnivores and they need protein in their diet. The chickens were well handled, well raised, well taken care of. And the eggs were incredible. Just like these were some of the deepest, darkest yolks. They came back at a high nutrient testing. They were incredible. They were still selling their eggs at the same price as every one of the farmers around them. They were selling them for $3.50. Well, even by the standards that we have on the market, those eggs are worth $10, $12 per dozen. And when you start to compare them to the protein you get from steak, it makes even more sense. When you take a look, if you got the same amount of protein from eggs as you did from steak, well, this is actually a $50 dozen of egg. Now, the major issue they had was that they were thinking that, well, no, we can't do that. You know, that there's no value in that. They didn't understand their value. And so we worked through the concept of them understanding what they were offering to market, what they were offering to their friends and their family. And they realized that it was of such exceptional value. And they started to work on, well, who are we to provide exceptional food? Well, truthfully, in a world that has terrible food, you're an exceptional individual if you decide to put the time and the effort into it. So that's a really important piece when we come down to it. So in closing, folks, I just want to say that if you don't take any of this and this doesn't make any sense to you, and who is this guy talking to us? I totally get it. That's fine. And, go on your merry little way. But remember that the essentials are always there, and that if we don't design our lives, just like if we don't design landscapes, then the nature will take the genetic bank within the soil and will populate that soil in the way that the interconnections within that ecology sees fit. And similarly, if you don't actively design the way you look at life, the way you look at your business, the way you look at permaculture, somebody else is going to supplant those ideas for you. And they are going to be for their benefit, not for yours. So we can always live by design. We don't have to live by default. And, thank you so much for the time. It's been great talking to you. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now from either from the folks from the webinar or for you folks directly. Thanks again.
Thanks. I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can, in the back with another beard and plaid shirt. I recognize that.
So I'm looking at the zones of brilliance.
Yeah.
And perennial passions.
Yeah.
I feel like I could write it like the front and back of 10 pieces of paper of things that I feel like I keep coming back to. So you narrow it down, have to narrow it down, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So when I work with a PDC from the beginning, and one of the ways I do this is we have a quick conversation in the beginning, and I touch base throughout the PDC, is we create this compost and fire list. And so on one side is fire, one side is compost. And all of the different iterations and skills and techniques and strategies and design patterns and all the rest of it go down on this list. And so this is probably the highest level, the grossest level of dividing what you learned in your PDC and all the different things that you were exposed to and starting to put them into compost. That can go back. I compost my scars and limitations. They can come back as good inoculum. And the things that I'm really fired up about, those are the things I'm really passionate about. Now from that list, now you have a truncated list for your passion list. So now you've got this list populated with, let's say, front and back, 20, 30, 40 things. And then you go through those 3 questions. Every single one you say, do I have skill in this? Do I actively have skill in this? No, I don't really have skill. This is just something that one of the instructors in my PDC said, and I thought, that was a great idea. Okay, well, I don't have skill in that. Okay. Do I enjoy this? Well, I don't have any skill in it. I've never actually done it, so I don't know. So that's also a no. And am I more for this? Well, I've never done it. So again, I don't know. And immediately that puts you into the categories of collective intelligence. And so there's 3 levels here. And this was explained to me best through a Vipassana teaching, which is this man goes to the doctor and he says, doctor, I have a problem. And the doctor says, okay, well, knowing what I know, here's your prescription. And he goes, oh, this is great. He walks away and he goes home and he goes, my doctor's so great. My doctor's so amazing. This prescription, this is amazing. Now that's just information. He hasn't taken the medicine. He hasn't thought about it. All that is information. And you'll find that in permaculture, you are susceptible to information hoarding. Most of us are information hoarders. We have more information than we know what to do with. And as Mollison said, any resource that does not have direct application is pollution. And so too can information become. So the man goes back to the doctor and he says, wait a second, doctor, explain this to me. Why is this the case? And so he walks him through the symptoms. He walks him through the diagnosis. He makes him understand. He rationally engages in this information. And he puts it into context. So now all of a sudden the man goes away and he has knowledge. So he's taken information into knowledge. He's put it into practice. He's thought about it rationally. So you're going through this. You're going through all these passion pieces. You're asking these questions. You're saying, well, does this actually make sense? Do I have experience? Do I enjoy this? Am I more for this? And then finally, last but not least, because this guy still hasn't taken the medicine, he goes out and he takes the medicine and he actually tries it out. And in that, he builds wisdom. He builds an experiential conversation where he knows that he's had this experience, this operation. I know how to seed save and I seed save. I'm never going to make a business seed saving. I don't want to. It doesn't do anything for me. Doesn't blow my hair back. I'm okay. I've worked as a stonemason. I can tell you this much. I have a passion for masonry. but I'm definitely not going to do it full time. I've seen the bodies of stonemasons and I know what body composition looks like. If I have to do it for my own house, I know how to do it. Fantastic. Great. Super. So in that, we start to take the big circle and we take it down to a little circle. So all these big ideas that came from permaculture, fire and compost, down to the ideas that I think I'm really fired up about. And then we start asking questions to high grade them. And the ones that come out on top, the things that I am passionate about, that I do have skill in, that I do find regenerative, well, those are the things I'm going to try out or explore first, because chances are that's where you can put in 1 unit of resource and you can get 2 or 3 back. And that's one of those big secrets in directing the flow of our lives, is really paying attention to the feedback that comes back from these types of conversations. Is that, okay, so the feedback is, yeah, I really do like working on these little boulevard gardens and doing curb cuts like Brad Lancaster has done down in Tucson, where we cut the curb and we allow water to come in, fill up the basin. It has filtration. It feeds some medicinal or food type plants, depending on the contamination potential that comes in and then flows back out down the road. Yeah, I really love that. And I want to get more experience in that. So that's a passion that I'm definitely going to look at. So I would say high grade those pieces of information and you'll be along your way. I've got a question here from the webinar. So I'll answer that one. And if somebody has a question in class, then we'll go back to that. Samir asks, could you give tools and strategies for mental strengthening and overcoming the inner and outer resistance? Yeah, for sure. Over the 20 years of being chronically suicidally depressed, I built a pretty extensive toolbox. So I use 4 really specific tools called the tools of sovereignty. And the sovereign is a wonderful archetype. The sovereign is both the creator and the created. And you can think about it, if you're keen on sort of medieval conversations or fantasy conversations, you can think about it as sort of a walled city state. And that walled city state has you in the center. And then you've got these walls that allow decisions or actions in or out. And I like to think about that as my context. That's my holistic context, that permeable membrane that allows things in and out. So context in and of itself is an incredible strategy for mental strengthening and limiting beliefs, because it immediately allows you to filter out the things that probably aren't a good idea. So that's one of the very first ones. One of the things that I found time and time again is this concept of, when we're frustrated, well, what are we frustrated about? Well, chances are we're frustrated because we've come against a reality that we don't necessarily agree with. I come against my microgreens and the entire microgreen bed has molded, and I've lost the potential for, what were microgreens at the time? I think it was about $45 per tray. I've lost that. Well, I'm angry. I'm getting frustrated with the reality of the situation as it is, because I want it to be something else. And so one of the tools is understanding that that's the case. And when that happens, another tool is to start to actively practice response versus reaction. And there's a 4-stage conversation here. The first stage is, well, interesting. Start to practice the response of interesting. I did a YouTube video recently about this incredible community garden that's just down the road for me. And I've never seen a community garden quite like this. There's maybe 20, 25 boxes that are 4 foot by 12 foot, 6 by 6 cedar, incredibly expensive wood. And we're in a rainforest. So think about that for a second. And they each have what's called a frost-free hydrant stand, each one of them, which usually would have one for a garden. And I want to go into potentially judgment, but if I hold off and I go, interesting, what were they thinking? What was the conversation here? How can I look at this from an objective point of view instead of going into a subjective or a quality point of view? And all of a sudden, I'm open to more possibilities. I'm able to see more conversation. So interesting starts the conversation off as we're practicing response versus reaction. Then we move to sort of a Spock-like raised eyebrow, fascinating. Why did they do this? What's this about? That invents curiosity. Then we move into what a number of folks internationally have found, which is when calamity befalls us, when drama befalls us, we say good. So still being in a place of having some of that, that depression that can come over me, I've come into a place of saying good. What can I do in this state that I can't do otherwise? And there's a number of things that I'm more eligible for in a state of depression than I am in a state of complete happiness, normality. I don't know what the state is otherwise, but that's another great piece. And then after that, we go from good to great. So recently we were in a situation where this farmer had taken out a number of trees, unbeknownst to him, that were actually of a higher value. But what can we do with this information now? Well, we can actually take a look at how the root development is. There's a value there. We can take a look at what potentially the assay of the wood quality is, because it was a timber crop. There's all of these values we can find, and permaculture says it best in terms of the problem is the solution, and really being solutions oriented. And at this point, once you've had sort of the permaculture lens over for a long time, you're constantly looking for solutions. You're constantly looking for these conversations. So, those are some of the tools that I use on a daily basis and with clients, because I would say about 25 to 45%, 45% of the folks I'm working with right now is just that, just working on those limiting beliefs, working on that mindset strengthening, because normally we've been actually educated to be quite brittle in our mindset. So Samir, thanks so much for that question. I really appreciate that. Any other questions from folks from the class or from the webinar?
I've had a lot of questions about business come up. So we've been doing invisible structures the last couple of days. And I always tell people, well, you don't have to do a land-based design as your project. You can do a business-based design. And I have gotten a lot out of your talk tonight, which was really fascinating. What do you tell people when they ask you, how do I permaculture in my business?
I don't know if anyone's put it to me that way. But the folks that I've worked with who've had a pre-existing business that they wanted to potentially have more connectivity or apply permaculture to, I think probably one of the most important pieces, and this was given really early on within the material within permaculture, is this idea of degenerative, generative, or regenerative. Degenerative being less than there was before, generative being sustained or the same or similar or status quo, and regenerative being more so. And when I first started, I can use myself as an example. I went through my business to understand what were the things that were degenerative about the business, be they from a systems oriented or operational standpoint. What were the things that were generative and regenerative? Taking a look at what were the type of enterprises or speaking engagements or ways that I was getting the message about permaculture out, what was degenerative, generative, and regenerative. And so literally applying the techniques of permaculture back onto the business to understand, where is the value that's coming out of this? Taking principles such as capturing and storing energy. So I did what's called a seasonal flow chart. And I took a look at where my income was coming from over the seasonality, because working with landscape, you'll find that there are certain times that there are spikes of people interested. So looking at that and running a permaculture education website, you'll find that into November, people really start to look for permaculture design courses. And then it drops off in end of December, January, and then it picks right up mid-January. And then it starts to arc, January, February, March. And this is definitely in more of the temperate climates where we have winter and people are looking forward into the spring and the summer. And you could track signups perfectly for PDCs, permaculture design courses, or other courses along that conversation. It was pretty amazing to see that conversation. And then taking that conversation of seasonality one step further, okay, when does all the design interest come? Okay, well, the design interest comes usually coming into spring, very heavy when it's super warm and you're already totally booked up, and then trails off into the fall, which then tells me from a client management or a community management perspective that the efforts to bring people into design should actually be outside of that window, just like farmers know that if they have what other people don't outside of seasonality, if you have tomatoes past when tomatoes are even before more beneficially from a price perspective, you're going to have a higher price point. Really taking a look at that seasonal flow and understanding where that comes from. So we worked with a number of students recently in the regenerative business mentorship, and we did a bunch of these seasonality interest charts for folks who were just starting business, and then flow charts for folks who had businesses. And that really brought a lot of context to the conversation about what potentially they could add to and what potentially they didn't want to work with. But that degenerative, generative, regenerative conversation, and one client in particular they had a ton of clients. They were like 30 to 45 clients in a design business a year. They really took a look at that. And one of the principles of regenerative business design is to be selective about of our clients. And they really pruned out 30% of their clients, the clients who were taking 80% of the effort and was returning 20% of the results, and just said, you know what, we're moving in a different direction. We're working more so on these larger scale jobs. We think you would be better served by a couple of our students who've then built these incredible businesses, and we'd like to pass you over to them. We think you'll be in great hands. We're going to work with the transition. So that was another really great example that showed that really focusing on being selective, because within a biomimic conversation, nature is quite selective. We're very specific, and we're always high grading the things that are working quite well within an ecological or interactive sense. So, those are the things that come up right off the top of my head, Delvin. But business is definitely something I could talk about for 30, 90 minutes or 12 months as the program is. So there's definitely lots more there, and I'm happy to answer more questions if there are.
That's great. Thank you. That's perfect.
I actually have a quick question. Well, maybe not quick. Do you have any strategies that you can recommend for educating people on why they should be paying more for your premium product?
So I heard everything up to the most important part, which is, do you have a strategy for educating people about, and then I didn't hear that.
Why should you be paying more for your premium ethical permaculture product?
Oh, yeah. Great question. Great. Yes, I do. And really, it's about differentiation. You have to understand the value or the story that you're providing. And we are hardwired, hard-coded to speak and listen to stories. It's how we transacted information originally, pre-language. When we got into cuneiform, it's how we worked with language. It was always about story. It was always about that interactivity, about what's the story and what's the conversation. And the stories that we tell help us to have what's called a value proposition. That's the nouveau business conversation. And the same people who wrote the business model generator wrote a brilliant book called Value Proposition. And it's really encapsulated in this maxim of price is what you pay and value is what you get. So when I take a look at half a cow, the value of that is immense. When I take a look at a food security conversation, when I take a look at a choice conversation in terms of people coming over, when I take a look at a price conversation, you save anywhere from 30, 40% when it comes to bulk food buy. But then when you take that next step further, and we'll go back to the poultry farmers, because that's a good example. These poultry farmers went back and I said, why are you different? And they said, well, we don't know how we're different. I said, great. Your work this week is to go and interview 3 conventional farmers and ask them how they raise their chicken from beginning to end. And all you're going to do is say thank you and thanks so much, and that you're learning. And interviewing is a great skill to start to culture and to build. And so they went out and they interviewed all these farmers, and they got a sense of, oh my goodness, like these farmers are anywhere from like half a square foot to 2 square feet per bird. We're 37. Most of these farmers are working on a conventional egg system, which means that none of the eggs are handled by hand. Our chickens are handled at least once or twice a day, and the eggs actually, they touch human hands. The egg color, the yolk color, which is one of the easiest non-scientific ways to understand the value of an egg in terms of its total quality, pale, almost the same color as the yolk. Ours is so bright orange, it's almost like fluorescent. And they went down and they just saw the conversation. And then what they did is they started to write about this. They said, there's lots of options out there. We know that you have lots of options, and our food isn't for everyone. This is a really important piece. This is a principle within regenerative business design, is to be indifferent. But here's what we do and here's why we do it. So what we do and why we do it, those are 2 other important pieces. So here's what we do. Here's the differentiation. Here's what makes us a different conversation. And then why we do it, point of view. Think about it this way. You have 4 different types of massage therapists you could go to. One's like a big metalhead. He's going to play Slayer as he's massaging you. There's going to be like a couple of black lights going on. That's number 1. Second, you've got sort of new age guy. He's going to be very soft. He's going to do a little bit of like Tibetan sound bowls. Then you've got somebody who's really sporty, who's a kinesiology student, and she's going to be prim and proper, exactly how it should be. And then you have another female massage therapist who's more in a sense of maybe a little bit more with a new age flow, is going to do a rune reading before you lay down. Inherently, when I say those four, everybody in that room sitting beside you goes, there's one person you want to go to more than the other, or none of them are of interest. And the point of view we put out, who we are and why we do what we do, is as important as what we're doing. And so when you're talking about a product, when you're talking about a service, your clients are over here on Island A, which is the Isle of Woe, which is the Isle of Frustration. And you're the ship captain that are taking them all the way over to Island B, the Island of Success, of Solutions. And that boat that takes you from Island A to B, it's important to talk about the solutions. And the more you talk about the solutions, the more you talk about the value in that. When we had our microgreens company, I work with a process called a niching statement. And the niching statement is, we work with these kinds of people who have these kinds of problems, who think this way about these problems, and we deliver these kinds of results. And so we worked with food aficionados who felt starved for nutrition, have same day cut microgreens delivered to their door that were so nutritious they could feel the difference. Well, immediately, you know exactly who's going to buy that product and who isn't. And the clients who loved us, and the clients who didn't, never even bought our product, and we never even had to worry about. So we went for a thin slice and then went for them really well. But, boiling it back down and just having a bit of a recap, I would say, be very selective, tell your story, know your value and tell it well, know why you're different than everybody else, be unapologetic about the story and why you tell that story. Make sure that you understand and communicate why it is you do what you do. These poultry farmers, they had everything on their site all about how good and how amazing they were in terms of their chicken, but they didn't talk about who they were as people. All of a sudden, they started talking about how they love playing board games. And immediately there was more affinity with their customer base. And they found that their customers liked them more so, not less so. Every time we put another piece of point of view out there, the three different types of clients that come to us, the yes, the maybes, and the no's, the maybes start to select more into the yes or no category. And most of the time in business that takes up time from you being the grinder, the person who's the technician, that takes up a lot of your technician time, is sorting people out. And so think about business this way. There's three really important thirds in a business. There's the grinding it out and doing a really good job of that, being absolutely peerless in your eggs, being peerless in your consulting, being peerless in how you work with community, being just the best you absolutely could be, because really there's no other option these days. You got to be exceptional. Second, there's reputation and building reputation and doing opportunities, or having opportunities to speak your story and tell your story and let people know who you are. And then third, there's having a really great sales process that people really enjoy. They actually like the intake process. I go through something called a good fit call, where I basically give 45 minutes of value away for free to further diagnose what's going on for a client. And think of it this way: in permaculture design and landscape design and anything we do, just like a doctor, the major amount of the value we give to people, 80% of the value, is in the diagnosis. Being in America, you guys know this well, diagnosis is the most important piece, because treatment can happen pretty much anywhere, and has to, in the way that the health system is set up there. There's entire cities in Mexico that are set up just for healthcare provision to folks who decide not to take the options within the state. So diagnosis is so important. So the way that I intake people is I help to diagnose them. I did this morning with a client. And we got to a point by the end of it, I said, you know what? I don't know if you were actually a good fit right now, which is kind of shocking. You're saying, don't hire me. I think you're better off to take care of all these open loops you have in your life right now. You don't need another thing to do. You need to take care of these open loops. You need to take care of all these sort of pseudo business ideas you have going on. You need to make a decision upon that and then come back and we'll work. I'm happy to work with you, but I think that's probably the best decision. He emailed me and he said, you know what? I think you're right. I think I really do need to just focus on what it is I'm doing. But that sales process, those 3/3, working on not only the reputation, the grinding out, but also the sales process, is really important. So hopefully that answered a little bit of the question. I know I added a bit more of that conversation, but hopefully that helped. Hmm.
Can you give any examples of in building out the base map as far as abstract zone analysis and sectors for a business? Maybe a few examples of how people were able to map their business into zones and sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, going back to that seasonality chart, that's exactly what that is. That's understanding when the energies will flow across the business or potentially flow across the business and when they won't. And all of this is talking to people. You know, we've lost an incredible skill with the amount of social interactions we have now digitally, of just being able to have a conversation with people and asking questions. And almost everybody, if you ask, hey, I'm working on this, I just need 15 minutes of your time. If you don't like it, don't worry, I'll leave, I'll hang up, no problems. Almost anybody will give you 15 minutes, and really starting to understand the problems. Because if you don't, you're just kind of shooting in the dark. So whatever it is that you're trying to understand in terms of the sector flow is, okay, well, what do we have for potential markets? That's an energy flow. What's the energy flow that this farm has access to? So I work with something called psychographics, which is an energy flow analysis of farms to understand, well, how close are all these different centers? And what's the general populace of these centers? Are they generally health conscious minded? Are they generally working class folks? Because the difference between that is a price point of about 30 to 40%. So understanding the psychographics of the people around you and understanding what the roads look like, understanding what access looks like, understanding what flows look like, and what times of years those happen, lets you know when you might, from a farm perspective, be able to apply that. But even if you just start taking verbatim the idea of, well, what's the solar access? What's the winter? What's the summer? What are all the different angles, and when does that come? Well, that is a seasonality of income. When does the income come? When does it come through? What can be resistance to that? Taking a look at some wind sectors are actually beneficial and some aren't. So what happens that we can't imagine or can't be ready for? And this is where the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb and his work in anti-fragility is so important. How do we build anti-fragile businesses and anti-fragile systems that, despite circumstance, actually flourish? And this is where understanding that sometimes these big volatile events, which Taleb calls black swans, events that we cannot predict, that have a big impact, and after the fact that people look back on and justify, but they couldn't predict it in the first place. We really start to see, well, if my business is going this way and something bad happens, I need to be able to adjust that. So recently, a friend of mine just found out that his permaculture education site was de-indexed from Google. And if you're de-indexed from Google, you don't exist. Like all of the keywords and the typing do not come to your site. And he saw that the traffic was down 70%. And he found this out. And it was through basically Google's cleaning house with a number of its websites. And it somehow marked his as a spam creation or an undesirable website. Now think about that for a second. If your business is based completely digitally and you're based upon another business that is in reality a hegemonic control over how we interact with the internet, is the search engine, is the way that people interact, and your business is completely based on the internet, that is a huge fragility point. That is a place where you're going to have a big problem. So luckily, he saw the writing on the wall years ago, and he said, well, I need to ensure I have a mailing list, and I need to ensure that I have a social media presence. And then he switched that to YouTube, and then he switched that to live YouTube. All of those pieces are about being as anti-fragile as possible. So the questions to ask yourself is, what is the major limiting factor, which I'm sure Delvin and your instructors has talked about, for this design, for this business? It could be finances, could be money, could be clients. And how potentially could those clients not come through the door? You know, what are the potential volatilities? And then starting to design around those volatilities. And when you do that, you're doing the client or the potential idea an incredible service, because improving the anti-fragility of a site, and that's how I view the design work I do now, is that I create anti-fragile properties. Problem is, it's a jargon word and you have to explain it. But I design anti-fragile properties. So that way, if there's a massive wind, this project I'm just working on has what's called a butterfly valley. And so the wind comes up and actually spreads up into the corners. And I found this out because it hit the topography of the southeastern corner and was funneled up in these incredible thermals, and took the drone I was using to survey the land and crashed it. I learned that lesson the hard way. But that's an incredible sector that you go, oh, well, we have to take a look and analyze pulse wind generation here, because that obviously is a piece. So similarly, looking at classic business issues, if you're a farmer, there's always going to be the idea of winter. Like, what do you do in winter? And if you can solve that problem, chances are you've got the problems in summer taken care of. There's a problem of direct marketing with farmers. Chances are farmers leave anywhere from 30 to 70% of the money on the table if they don't direct market. So if they leave the marketing to the wholesaler, they're going to be leaving a lot of money on the table. And that's where food aggregators like Farmbound and Jay Crawford and her partner come into play. All of those pieces are just taking a look at the fragility points, the weak links, as we talk about in holistic life context and holistic management, and designing around those weak links, always taking a look at the thing that could break that system and saying, okay, well, how do we design around it? This is called red team design. And so when I design these days, I have 3 to 4 other designers actively proof my design and go, you know what, mate, that's not good. You haven't thought of this, this, and this. So bringing in other people and not being the lone driving factor and falling prey to the ego of I know everything is another really important piece about doing that sector and energy analysis. So I would just take the literal translation, the pollution, the fire risk, the noise risk, all of those pieces, and really say, how could this business be lost? Noise is a good one because there's this great conversation going on right now about the signal and the noise. And in a place that is really, or in a world that's really the Internet of Things, there is so much noise, there's so much distraction. So how do you turn down the noise and turn up the signal? And working with businesses is a good one. I find that holistic context really turns down the noise quite quickly, because immediately you're going to say what's important and what's not important. So working with these farmers just today, they were talking about how finances and ensuring that both partners know what they need to do in the farm is important. And immediately we create what's called statements of purpose that they use as filters on a daily basis to say, wait a second, are we putting our time towards our most important priority? And that's their daily statement of purpose. So they're always bringing themselves back to exactly what they need to be working on. And so I would take that approach if you were taking a look at sectors.
Thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome. Great question.
I had one other question about when you were talking earlier about defining yourself as a business. Why are you different? What do we do? Why do we do it? Being peerless and things like that. How does one balance that very helpful attitude with also being supportive of the other people in your industry, so that we're fostering a cooperative market rather than a competitive one?
That's a great question. Yeah, great. I think part of it is that mindset strengthening piece and starting to reprogram our minds. So the word competition originally came from the Latin of compito, which is to strive with, not against, to strive with. And competition for me is really about understanding where other people have already played and created a red ocean, an ocean of great competition, and saying, well, if there's a microgreens, a massive amount of microgreens in the city that I created my microgreens company, Victoria, which there was 4 other folks. Why would I even start? And what ended up happening was, well, is this market being served by same day cut microgreens that are carbon neutral or negative as possible? And the answer was no. And so there was a really good friend of mine who was also doing microgreens. And so we flat out said, we called him up and we said, hey, mate, we're not competing against you. Anybody who's served by you, we're not even touching. If we go to the restaurant, they say, oh, we already have, we're already serviced by Salt Spring sprouts and mushrooms. we're going to say, great, you guys have a great provider. Don't worry about it. Even if they say, no, we really want to work with you. If it ever comes back to you, you can come to us. So part of it is just holding ourselves to a higher level of integrity and saying we're going to be as pristine with our business practices as possible. And the indifference piece is another great piece that allows us to be pristine. So when I intake folks on good fit calls for land and life design, I say, after I tell them what I think is a good treatment, quote unquote treatment for the diagnosis, you know, what I think my value could be to them, I then say, and you should absolutely call some other designers, and here's the name of 2 or 3 that I really love and like and are colleagues, and you should see what their conversation is and see if we're a good fit. Now, that is a different way to conduct business. That is a non-scarce, this is mine and only mine way of conducting business. And it holds myself and the people I work with to higher integrity. So that creates that conversation. The other conversation, how do you balance the work you want to do with the world by still being as exceptional as you can be in your field, is finding the clients, the conversations that you absolutely love and you would just do regardless. And so when I went to Kenya, when I went to Cuba, I do a lot of fundraising with my clients during the year and the people I work with to make sure I have the funds to be able to go and do that, because that's the work there's nothing like being on a piece of land, working with the local populace and taking care of 40% of their caloric needs in short order. And then coming back 2 or 3 years later and going, my goodness, there's more food here than I could have ever imagined. And so there's that balance of, okay, well, I still need to make sure that the business itself is profitable. And then when that's profitable and my cup is full, great, where am I going to pour that? Who am I going to give that to? And so every year I kind of have a different theme personally for mine. And this is really the year of the other. And so already I've had a number of folks who'll phone and wanted just a little bit of advice or a little bit of conversation. And I ended up speaking to an ex-student of mine for about an hour, just helping them out and helping to direct them. And right at the beginning, I said, listen, this is definitely a service that I usually provide, but I don't think you need to contract this. I think you can just do exactly what you need to do. Here's a few things to think about. And at the end of it, they said, my goodness, like, do you ever mentor people under design? And it's funny. This is the year that apparently is my year to help people be mentored underneath a higher level of design criteria, because I've already had 3 people reach out. And so I think the way that I'm answering this is, make sure that the garden is in order, if we're going to use metaphor. So that way you have surplus. And once you have surplus, then you can decide where that surplus is going to go. You can decide if it's going to go back into developing courses and products that would be of value to the people you want to be in this work. So right now I'm developing Super Soils, the exquisite art of making compost, with a soil food web practitioner in my area, a low-cost course compared to some of the courses that are out there from the soil food web to really help people just make exceptional compost in 30 days. I'm able to then take those resources that I built through design and other work and direct them into something that is currently making $0 and may never make any money. But I think it's a really important piece. There's a lot of people that aren't being served a very digestible entry-level conversation about compost. And in that, we're developing another course called Super Soils, the living soil, to make what is the soil food web, which can get very heady very quickly, very simplistic. So that way, turf managers, golf course owners, institute managers, folks who just own a lawn, I'm not going to try and convert them off of a lawn to a garden or into a food forest or any of that. One of the things that I was taught in my PDC is meet people where they're at and go where you're invited. I'm actually just going to say, here's how you can take better care of your lawn without poisoning your children or yourself. And here's an easy, simple way you can do it that's cheap. Now we're speaking the language of the people around us. So, make sure the business and the garden's well taken care of. And then when you have surplus, put it towards the aims and the needs that you think are really important. I think I'll finish this question with what a friend of mine, Eric Olson, did with Permaculture Artisans and the Permaculture Skills Center, was when he created Permaculture Artisans, which is arguably one of the largest and most profitable permaculture businesses and employs some of the most incredible individuals. he had a community engagement plan instead of a marketing plan. He said, how can I give to my community? And so he donated the design and a bunch of the time, the installation of the plants to do an edible landscape around City Hall of Sebastopol, California. And that served him up a year and a half of design work and installation work. So I think first and foremost is just how can we serve, how can we be of best value to individuals? And this work I do, this hour and a half, for me is a gift to anybody who's interested to have me on within a permaculture design certificate, because this was the information I wish I had had at the beginning. And it's just a way to be able to give back to community. And the only way, I think this is really important, because a lot of people in permaculture get to this martyrdom savior conversation and they end up just with nothing, is that unless you fill that cup, it's going to be really hard to pour it out into somebody else and help somebody else out. So, make sure that the cup is full, make sure that the business is profitable, make sure you're taken care of, so that way you then can turn around and pivot and say, okay, I've got more for others.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. Delvin, I think we're at an hour and a half, so I'm going to say goodbye.
So much. What an awesome honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks. Thanks so much for being a part of this incredible movement and being in this work. We need all hands on deck. It's an all hands on deck sort of conversation and situation. If you're interested to reach out and give me some feedback about the presentation, I'd love that. Or if you just want to drop a line, you can reach me at allpointsdesign.ca. I'm also on YouTube, and would just be a pleasure to hear from you folks and hear what you're doing in the future. So thanks again. Thanks, Delvin. Thanks so much for what you do in the world. It's an incredible gift, all the resources you do and everything you gather from the incredible pilgrimages you go on. And thank you so much, folks. Such a pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared. Bless you.